And so with that, I want to hand it over to JoAnn Foley-DeFiore. She is one of the team members on our Equipping the Church community team, and we're very excited to have her be a part of that team. And what she's going to do is that for the bulk of this time, she's going to share a little bit about that individual and sort of institutional racism and how it plays out. She's a really great person to speak on this. She's been doing this work for a few decades at this point. She's also worked on a few committees to do this work in her own department. And in addition to that, she's married with 2 awesome kids. So that's always a great thing. And she's been a member of Calvary Church since 2010. So with that, if you brought some pen and paper, I'd encourage you to pull it out because she has lots of good things that she's going to teach us about. And I'm going to hand it over to you, JoAnn.
Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks for coming, everybody who's here today. It's a little bit difficult to be teaching you guys on Zoom and teaching this topic to you on Zoom, because normally we'd be together in a classroom. We would have maybe a whole semester, maybe more than a semester together to really dive deep into this topic. I would see you, I would get to know you, you would share some personal stories, and you would get to know me. And so we would build rapport and trust over the semester. We don't have that today, but I would like to share one thing about myself, which is that I first learned about white privilege and racism as a topic of study as an undergraduate in 1988, so that tells you how old I am, as a sociology major. And in 1988 is when the article called White Privilege came out, even though that concept existed long before that. And I read it as a junior in college, and I just absorbed it. And it really convicted me when I realized that I could go shopping without worrying about being followed or harassed, or I could watch TV or the news or any other curriculum and see my race represented fairly and evenly. This was eye-opening back in 1988 to me. 1988, though, was also a year of a lot of personal troubles for me, and that my very best friend, childhood friend, was killed in the Pan Am bombing of 1988, the plane crash bombing. And it's so interesting to me that even though I was having a lot of personal troubles and private issues that year, I was able to look at this article and really reflect on the fact that I still had a lot of white privilege. So one thing about white privilege is that it's a lot of unearned advantages that we have, and we're gonna talk about that later. So that was 32 years ago, and I've been studying this and teaching this since that time, but even with all of that, you know, knowledge in quotes and studying and experience, I still was thrown off guard when coronavirus hit and COVID-19, we were asked to wear masks. I was expecting health disparities. I knew that was coming. I knew that African Americans were going to be disproportionately disadvantaged with this illness. But what I wasn't prepared for was when one of my African American students told me over a Zoom conference call that he was really, really concerned about wearing a mask in public. He was worried about how he would be perceived, about how he would be judged, and he was also very fearful for his own life and safety. So even after all these years, I was still taken off guard about another area of white privilege. I didn't have to worry about that. I never even thought about it until he pointed it out. So I'm sharing that story to tell you that I have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. So let's get started with our topic for today. We're here today because of the outpouring of people's interest in race and racism after George Floyd was murdered. And George Floyd was just the tip of the iceberg. He's just the tip of the iceberg of all of the Black lives lost. And it feels a little bit these days like we're cramming for an exam, that we are seeing a lot of things on social media, a lot of things. We're watching YouTube videos and TED Talks. And we know in the teaching world that when you cram for an exam, you often don't retain the information. So with the Run Network, we want to have these teachings because we want you to remember. We want you to study and learn and digest the concepts so you can remember. So our teaching goal for today is to understand that racism and white privilege are really one system. And we want to understand how racism and white privilege, the origins of that, as Austin Channing Brown said, and how they work together to systematically privilege one group of people, white people in general, and oppress another group of people. And we hope to illustrate how we've ended up with so many Black lives lost. So my learning objectives for you, we hope that at the end of this seminar, seminar, we hope that you can be empowered with definitions and key concepts about systemic racism and white privilege. We hope that you can identify where you can take action. And very importantly, we hope that you know how to pray against the specific aspects of systemic racism. So let's start with this system. It's a little bit more complicated than this picture here, but we're gonna start with the basics. So this system of racism and white privilege operates at least two levels, the two levels that we're gonna cover today. There's the individual level, and that's the level of our attitudes and our actions. And then there's the institutional level, and that's the level of systems and policies. Systems like our education system or the healthcare system or the criminal justice system, policies like laws or policies that maybe universities have. So that's at the institutional level. And this whole system, the two levels reinforce each other. So as individuals change, they can change institutions. As institutions change, they can change the individual. What has happened historically and has continued today is that this system works in such a way that it oppresses Black people and other peoples of color with a lack of power, and simultaneously it advantages white people with power and privilege. So let's first start with a definition of the white privilege part of the system. So the white privilege part, we refer to it as this backpack because in the article that was written about it in 1988, she refers to it as a knapsack. White privilege is the unearned rights, advantages, and privileges that are accrued to white people because of this system. And also white privilege is meant to be invisible. So if you've never noticed it before as a white person, it's because you weren't meant to notice it as a white person. In this next slide, I'm just going to show you some examples of it because I think that's the best way to illustrate the concept. And I'm not going to talk, I'm just going to let you read them and maybe jot down wherever you're taking notes, the ones that resonate the most with you, that you identify with. So the one that stands out most for me as a mom is that I've never had to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own physical protection. That's a burden that Black moms have had to have and other people of color have had to have as parents. But as a white woman, I've had the privilege of not having to teach my children about that. The other one that stands out to me is that I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial ethnic group. My actions and my words at a meeting at work, for example, or a meeting of moms, for example, is never used as a reflection of my entire racial ethnic group. So this is just the very surface definition of white privilege, but just think about some of these examples in your own life. Okay, we're going to stick at the individual level still here. So how does racism and white privilege look at the individual level? So first of all, the individual level includes discrimination. Discrimination is negative treatment and action towards people based on their race. These are individual actions, such as following somebody around Walmart, assuming that they're going to steal something, or calling someone the N-word. This is what we call individual discrimination. It can also take the form as microaggressions, and these are brief, kind of daily, intentional or unintentional actions or words that can negatively slight people of color or Black people. The second kind of individual racism is called, well, we call it a couple different things. So let me give you all of the names: prejudice, stereotyping, bias, and bigotry. So I'll just define each one of them. Prejudice are those negative attitudes and feelings. It's an attitude and a feeling. They kind of go together towards individuals based on solely their membership in a racial group. Stereotyping are these mistaken generalizations that we make about people in a particular racial ethnic group. And then finally, bigotry is an extreme version of prejudice that borders on hatred. So it's still prejudice, but it's an extreme version. And so a lot of these show up as our biases. These are biases that we have about people based on their racial ethnic group and other characteristics. But if you look at this image here, you can see that we have three different individuals with three different racial ethnic groups represented, or at least 2 to 3, but they're also dressed differently. And when you look at this image, you might be able to notice where you have a different feeling or different attitude based on skin color, based on how they're dressed, based on how their hair is done. And these are the types of things that we want to uproot in our own lives. Okay, so we just quickly covered the individual level racism. And I know that was really fast, but we're going to talk about the institutional level racism as well, because that is an important piece that keeps this whole system in place. So let's first define what it is. So institutional racism and white privilege. This is a system that was created and is actually operating. People say the system's broken, but the truth is that it was created to operate in this way, to privilege certain people over others. And so what it refers to are discriminatory rules, policies, practices that are within organizations or within institutions. So it's not individuals anymore. These are rules and regulations that are within institutions. And what happens is these rules and regulations result in unequal access to the goods of society, the economic goods, the services, and the opportunities, educational or economic opportunities or otherwise. Unequal access to those components based on race. This system of institutional racism and white privilege is also deeply rooted in the history of our country. 400 plus years old, this system has been in place. It's also part of our cultural beliefs and ideologies. And it's reinforced over time by all these different institutions, the healthcare institution, educational institution. It continues to be reinforced and recreated by our culture over time. So let's look at some examples. I always think that the best way to learn something is by looking at some concrete real-life examples to show how systemic racism and systemic white privilege operates. So let's look at the first one, which is redlining. And redlining was actually an outcome of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and segregation. And in 1932, the Federal Housing Administration developed a homeowner's loan practice known as redlining. They asked 46 cities in the United States to create these maps, and you're looking at one right now of the greater Seattle area. These maps were split up into zones based on the most hazardous, which are the red zones, to the most desirable, which are the green zones. And Black homeowners were steered away from the best and most desirable neighborhoods. They were also denied loans in the most desirable neighborhoods, as well as some other neighborhoods. And it was called redlining because the most hazardous and least desirable neighborhoods were in red. This practice continued formally until 1975. So it was literally a policy that was put in place for banks and real estate agents. It was not abolished until 1975 with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And it continues today informally. And this is why we see so much segregation in neighborhoods in cities. We're still seeing the fruits of this. Okay. Well, one of the fruits that we see is what we call today environmental racism, which is a term that's been around for about 20 years, although the outcomes have been around a lot longer. And so here again is Seattle, another map of Seattle. And as you can see, currently still the highest concentration of people of color is still in those places that were red zones before. And the highest concentration of environmental toxicity is also in those areas. In fact, the number one factor that's associated with whether or not a neighborhood is going to have 3 or more environmental toxins in it is the race, the percentage of Black people living in that neighborhood or Hispanic people living in that neighborhood. And these polluters can be things like waste incinerators, chemical factories, toxic waste facilities are often clustered in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black or predominantly Latino. So we can see that the system has operated to advantage white individuals. The history of redlining has allowed them to be in neighborhoods that are the most desirable. If you know anything about Seattle, these have the best views, they're along the water, and they're the cleanest. And it has disadvantaged or oppressed Black individuals into neighborhoods that are less healthy and have public health, high public health risks for people living in those neighborhoods. Okay, if you have questions while I'm talking, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. So feel free to ask questions while we're going, and I'll try to answer them at the end. Okay, so our next example really comes out, it's connected to residential segregation. It is what we call the wealth gap. And hopefully you can see the right hand of your screen. If not, you should maybe move the pictures of the people talking away from there. But this is the wealth gap. And what this map is showing is the median family wealth, and wealth includes property, assets, the ability to home ownership, savings accounts, and the median is the number at which 50% of white families are above that number and 50% are below that number. So this map is showing that for white families, the median amount of wealth is $171,000 in savings, in home ownership, in car ownership, 10 times more than the median Black family's wealth, which is only at $17,000, which means that 50% of Black families actually have less than that in terms of wealth. And so this is really the legacy of Jim Crow laws and slavery, which denied Black families and Black individuals educational opportunities and employment opportunities. And then in the future, it shows a lot of differential outcomes for the future. The lack of ability to save for college, for example, or pay for college, the increase in college debt for Black families because of not having the generational wealth. So again, this is a really good example of where white privilege is generational. Okay, our last example has to do with the healthcare field. And in this image, you're looking at Dr. Marion Sims, who's considered the father of gynecology. He was the former president of the American Medical Association. He and many white doctors went to the South and performed many gynecological surgeries and developed tools through experiments on Black slave women without their knowledge, without their consent. Even worse, they did it without anesthesia because they were under the cultural belief, the dominant racial ethnic system belief that Black people did not feel pain. And so the field of gynecology is based on these experiments. We developed so many they developed so many instruments. Even C-sections were performed on these women without their consent and without anesthesia. So Black women were dehumanized and their bodies were used and abused for the benefit of white women and other women who to this day benefit from those historical practices. Is this over? Well, not exactly. We do have a lot of outcomes from this historical racial abuse in the healthcare field. There's been a legacy of that belief that Black women don't feel pain or Black people don't feel pain. Current research in the field shows that when Black women are in labor, their pain is considered less severe than their white counterparts. Research also shows that doctors and nurses attend less to Black women in labor than their white counterparts. That's been measured. And so what is one of the outcomes of that? There is an enormous health disparity between Black and white women in terms of maternal mortality. So this column over here on the right, 2011 column, says that of all the pregnancy-related deaths, 43% of them are Black women and only 12% are white women. Yet in the population, Black women make up 13% of the population and white women make up 60%. So all things being equal, that's the percentage we should see in the deaths. Instead, Black women are 3 times as likely than their white counterparts to die in pregnancy-related deaths. And we can trace some of this back to the cultural norms of the Marion Sims era, as well as the current research showing the differential treatment for Black women and white women. So that's a lot of stats, that's a lot of information. Let's just take a pause with your notes. If you want to ask some questions in the chat, you can, but take a moment just to think about right now, how has this information presented helped you so far to identify some of your own biases, to know how to pray better about the sin of racism, and to better understand the systemic aspect of racism and white privilege in your community? Maybe you can take a picture of those questions and ask them to yourself later, and maybe journal and talk to some other people in your community. We're going to move on here. So I could talk about many, many, many more examples, and in future webinars, we will do that about institutional racism in healthcare and in education and around COVID-19 and in the legal system and in public policy, home ownership, interviewing, and most especially the differential mortality rates due to COVID-19. But we're going just to summarize to say that the effects of racism and white privilege do add up. And we can see that the system overall oppresses Black people in particular. And here are just some of the things that occur for Black individuals, and it advantages white people. And here are just a few things that come out of this particular lecture on how they're advantaged. Having said that, we still need to just face one more thing today. The system of white privilege has led us to this moment in history. We have to face the painful legacy of lynching and the loss of Black lives. 4,000 people were lynched Black people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. And those are only the ones that we know of. Just think about 1968. I was born in 1968. Some of you were alive in 1968. People were being lynched during your lifetime. Many of them were lynched for perceived infractions like walking behind a white woman or attempting to quit a job or reporting a crime. So George Floyd was just the tip of the iceberg on top of a long, long history of lynching and Black lives lost in America. Black Lives Matter more, and that's why we're here today.